And it's been an honor to be here. We were here, we started in, I think, April of last year. And if you do not know, I'm Marnita. I'm the CEO of Marnita's Table. We are based in the Twin Cities, and we are both a regional organization, but we are nationally known for what we do, which is effective participatory action research, which means that if you don't just go and do surveys, but you actually engage with the community and really sit down and listen to their concerns. And we wanted to make sure that we were getting a broad set of, the district said, we want to make sure that this isn't just send out a survey and the people who are most inclined to answer a survey will answer it, and then we might miss students, we might miss teachers. And so we added, I think we started with wanting to do just 2 events, and I think we added like 8. And so we're just without further ado. So our original goals were to deliver a transparent engagement process to hear the experiences and recommendations of the students, staff, and community members related to school resource officers and school safety. And we really wanted to make sure that 80% of the people who attended had a chance to share their perspectives of the school resource officers, and that they learned something about SROs. And one of the big things that we had as a takeaway from this is that a lot of people didn't even know how SROs got into the buildings, or they didn't really think of them as police officers. They thought of them as their friend or something else. And so there was a lot of uncovering that was done through the process, and even from the first events to the last events, we were constantly sort of adding to a data bank for people so that they could actually find out, oh, what kind of training, what kinds of things were going on. And then it wasn't just delivering this in a transparent process, it was engaging your groups of students, staff, families, community organizations, unions, administrators, and local tribes. And we worked with NAE, there you are. And there was a lot of change that was kind of going on right at the time. And thank you so much. The district was really helpful in opening doors and making sure that things got in backpacks, and families who might be harder to reach were included in the process. And so we did that. We did that when we worked with integration specialists. And then the last piece of it, we are going to have all the 360 report and the raw data. Anybody in the district, if you are here today, you'll be able to go out and click on our website and go through so that you can see the data, spend time with it if you have people that you want to see it. So anyway, but we exceeded all those goals. And we made every attempt to ensure that the voices of individuals from communities that have historically been marginalized were in the room. The process was fair and unbiased, and that we got the widest range of voices possible. But we found that there was not just low trust or lack of trust. There was actually very high distrust, antipathy, and assuming the worst. And what we meant by that is, it did not matter what perspective people were coming from. They assumed that who was ever doing this work came with an axe to grind and had a specific viewpoint. So to hold that space was really important for the table, but also for everybody who came into the room. And I'm so excited that Adele is now in the district, because I remember on our very first event, Adele came in and said, like, who are you and what is happening here? It was very exciting. But we want you to pay attention to this. Not just low trust or lack of trust, but there was actually high distrust across difference. And that is probably impacting your everyday interactions in your community. Pay attention to that. So there was a fear of retaliation for speaking. There was assumption that the process would be biased. There was anger that they felt their voices weren't going to be heard or respected. Anger that an outside organization was hired. And then we discovered, because of COVID, things were constantly changing on the ground. Like, could we be in person? We actually came and did all the high school and middle school ones in person with students because they were in school. And we did a couple events at night, but we added a survey, and we added some other techniques to make sure we really were getting a wide range of voices. And we, as I said, multiple points of contact, multiple events when we originally started small. And go ahead. So we had a budget of $30,000, and our actual expenses, you'll notice today, and we're very transparent about this, we're a 501c3, we're a nonprofit. We thought this conversation was important enough that Marnita's Table itself basically gave you, the organization, the school district, an equity grant. We decided the conversation was so important that instead of saying, no, we can't really do what you said, and now that we're embedded, we said, no, this is an important conversation. This is a conversation that matters. And Marnita's table, 80% of our income comes from somebody who hires us, and we have some really big clients like Blue Cross Blue Shield and states, hire us, that kind of thing. And we put, instead of being a for-profit, we put the extra money we earn back into local communities to build equity. It is part of our social entrepreneurial model. So we wanted you to just see 1/3 of it went back to the community, outreach and event support, about a little over 5,000, event food and beverage, and around event supplies, and not including travel expenses. We stayed in hotels, we put money back into your local economy just by being here. And we think it's really important when we're hired in an area to put money back into the community. So we activated with the integration specialist and internal school and communications emails and newsletters. But in addition to that, we had the Marnita's Table team. We did calls and emails to 17 organizations in the spring and summer. We had August outreach specialists, 2-day visit to Duluth to distribute flyers and direct invitations to 9 community businesses, 20 community organizations, door knocking at the West Side neighborhood homes, commitments from Community Action Duluth, Lighthouse, Adult and Teen Challenge, Women's Resource Center, Damiano Center, Mentor Duluth, and then NAACP to share with community members. And when we first came, the NAACP said, we already presented a report, we're not interested. And we said that we're unbiased, we just really, if you want that report, and they were able to submit their entire report through our mechanism to make sure that we weren't redoing work and that it was additive instead of supplanting what local people in the community were doing. And then, is that it? That's 7, so I have one more, right? And then we also sent out surveys with integration specialists and internal school emails, and then we also did paper surveys, and we only obtained 17, but this was actually hard to go out on the streets with masks on and ask people to participate, particularly during COVID. Again, high distrust in your community. And then October emails to community organizations with commitment from the NAACP to share with their membership. So we just kept going out and saying, we still have time. We still have time to say what you want. And now, I think we're going to go to 9. And I think, are you here?
I am here.
Hi, the voice from, so meet Lex. Alexis Trinity is our head. There's Lex right over there. Hi, Lex. Lex is getting their PhD from Cornell in Science and Technology. Did I do that right?
Science and Technology Studies, that's correct.
Yes, is getting their PhD, so they are on Cornell campus right now on the East Coast, but they are our head of research and our head of participatory action research. So Lex, take it away.
Thank you, Marnita, and certainly thank you, Assistant Superintendent Bonds and your whole team. I'd also like to say a quick thank you to all of you in the audience right now who may have participated in events or filled out a survey or been a part of organizing or who just showed up tonight to learn a little bit more about what's been going on in your community. So tonight you'll see we have a rich set of data for you. As Marnita alluded to, we had several methodologies that we used to connect with people and provide opportunities to give feedback. So I'm going to do a little deep dive into that. Before I do that, I do want to highlight a couple of things. So as Marnita mentioned, if you are interested in this data, you want to look at it a little bit more later yourself, or go in depth, or download copies of the reports, or the information it's based on. All of that is available on our website at projects.marnitastable.org. So you can view it there, you can download it and share it. We do try to be transparent and make that accessible to everyone. So don't feel like you need to remember everything tonight if it gets a little overwhelming. And indeed, as was mentioned earlier, after the presentation, we will have some time to kind of process, to collect your thoughts, to jot down some questions while you're snacking or chatting with other folks who are there tonight. So you will have some time to process what you hear and pull together any questions you may have for me or for anyone else who is there today about the process. And of course, you have your district representatives as well. So we'll try to make sure your questions get answered by whoever is the appropriate contact. And certainly, again, when you are jotting down those questions, if you have questions about what you hear in this presentation, I will be around for the duration of the event. I won't be on screen the whole time, but I will be here for the Q&A session, so you'll be able to get those questions answered. Further, if you are like me and sometimes your questions don't come right away, they come a little bit later and you're like, I forgot to ask that, I really wanted to know. You can also reach out to me directly at alexis@marnitastable.org. So that's ELEXIS at marnitastable.org. Or if you don't remember that or you didn't have a pen, you can certainly grab any of my colleagues there tonight and they can make sure you get my email address. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into a bit of an overview about the two methodologies that we used, or the processes that we used to collect information and to connect with community members. I will give you a quick overview, and then I'll dive in first to what we found in the first process that we used to get information, so the in-person events that some of you may have participated in. After that, I'll dive a little bit deeper into the survey, and you'll see these are slightly different populations of people who chose to be in person or who were able to come in person, and people who were able to fill out the online surveys, which were much more successful than the in-paper surveys, so thank heavens for a multitude of resources. All right, so to begin with, as I mentioned, the two methodologies that we used to connect with folks and to collect feedback were in-person events, which were structured around small group guided conversations, and which produced 59 pages of qualitative notes from all of the small groups taken together over the course of 8 events, which were hosted on 4 days. So yes, some of those days had multiple events. The dates of those events were May 27th, September 22nd, 23rd, and 30th of last year, 2021. And we welcomed 222 participants to those events. The demographics of those events included staff and students and community members. About 21% identified as Indigenous, Black, or other people of color. And about 70% were youth under the age of 24, largely current students in Duluth Public Schools. So that's something to keep in mind when you're listening to the themes from Mindstorm. Mindstorm is what we call our small group discussions. So that first bit of the feedback we're jumping into, lots of students participating. You'll see there were also staff and students and family members and community members. But again, just important to keep that in mind. When we talk about the survey, I'll get a little bit in depth about the population of the survey. So that was less ethnically diverse and a lot more adults. So there were some youth who filled out an online survey, but for the most part it was adults. It was family members, it was staff and teachers and community members. So again, we'll get into the breakdown of that when we discuss the survey in depth. But for now, you can know that 225 people completed the online surveys. And again, we'll get into the details of that when we discuss it. Before I move on to the feedback that we received, I do want to say a quick thank you to our host schools for our in-person events. So students and staff participated from a whole host of Duluth area public schools. However, there were 4 schools in particular that were kind enough to welcome folks in person to have these conversations. Those included Lincoln Park Middle School, Denfeld High School, Ordine East Middle School, and East High School. All of those conversations were held in English. And on the next page, we'll go ahead and jump into the small group discussion themes that occurred at these in-person events. So again, there's a lot of information. Don't be overwhelmed by the text. You can always come back to this later. I only have 45 minutes with you tonight for the presentation, so I'm going to try to get to the bulk of it. But again, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me later. So some of the key themes that emerged from the small group discussions, we try to look at themes that are emerging not just in one discussion group or on one day, but really across the events. So themes that we saw, one of the big ones, first of all, that we saw emerging from multiple discussion groups across the different days that we welcomed people to the table included the need for more funding for guidance counselors and in general more support staff for larger school populations. So a number that came up pretty frequently was the notion of having 1,500 students for 3 counselors and concerns about real teacher and staff and counselor overwhelm. This is something that you'll see later in the survey kind of came up as an issue specifically related to COVID, of course, and to staffing challenges. But in general, people were concerned to make sure that there's enough support staff in general in the schools. Many participants of the in-person events shared that they found counselors and teachers to be a more useful resource for specific tasks or needs that they had related to school safety broadly. With some reporting a sense that, quote, there are other people in the building who do the same thing as SROs or school resource officers, but better. Teachers in particular, or people who identify themselves as teachers in the in-person events, were particularly appreciative of communication support from the SROs. So they pointed out that it's really helpful having someone who can relay across campus what's happening in real time, who can make sure that different staff and different teachers are on the same page and know when something happens or when more support is needed. A few also mentioned that walkie-talkies are an amazing technology and that if more support staff had those kinds of technologies, they could provide a similar function, making sure that campuses are really well connected and up to date so that people are getting the help they need when they need it. Broadly, there was widespread interest in receiving more detailed information about SROs. So this is an important one that'll come up again when we discuss the survey results. People varied, you'll see throughout, people varied in what they knew about SRO training or roles in, whether they knew where they came from or what they did on campus or what they were supposed to be doing. So given that kind of variance in sort of knowledge and background with SROs, it makes sense that a lot of people were curious about how they could get more information about how SROs are trained, what their job descriptions are, what their duties are, but by and large, people were interested in knowing what information was out there and how they could access it. People shared that they had expectations that the role of the SRO was intended to be about upholding the law without using excessive force. In particular, there were specific concerns raised. This is especially true among participants who described themselves as students. There were concerns raised about the use of force, specifically tasers and guns, or the idea of armed presence. Many of the students said that they saw SROs as an escalating force, while a few actually mentioned that they saw SROs as a kind of protective bulwark against specifically, quote, ghetto kids. This is an interesting note to keep in mind because it suggests embedded assumptions about what exactly it is that makes a student or a situation a problem that needs to be solved, and how we might go about rectifying those problems or addressing particular kinds of issues that might be raised. So again, some of the sort of assumptions that kind of come out in some of the table conversations, not all, were related to race or class, or again, embedded ideas about what is a good kid, what does a good kid look like, and what is a problem, what does a problem child look like. Not my words, but a way of thinking about some of the concerns that were raised. Additionally, some of the participants at the in-person events who identified themselves as parents said that they were reluctant to see firearms in schools, no matter who is carrying them. This is connected to a lot of other themes that come up, primarily the big theme about concern about gun violence. So this is something you see in general that came up in conversations about school safety broadly, not just to do with SROs specifically, but again, it'll come up later that this is a big concern for all categories of participants. So teachers and staff and students and families were all pretty concerned about gun violence in the community, in schools. So unsurprisingly, there were a lot of opinions about and questions and concerns about that. Additionally, some of the questions that were raised with respect to SROs and data that's available about them, what we know, how they're trained, involved questions about efficacy. So some of the students in particular shared that they didn't believe that SROs would be able to help in a worst case situation, specifically referring to an active shooter situation, which again was looming large in the mind of respondents. Sort of related to this, one group put it by saying, quote, Parkland had an SRO, with the presumption that it didn't prevent the tragedy that happened there. Other groups spoke about this theme by saying that outside police would in any case be necessary and would be present during such an event. Several groups mentioned the Duluth area police as being very responsive, quick to arrive on the scene, raising some questions about redundancy in that case, or questions about clarification about the sort of distinction between off-campus police and school resource officers. This is another one that you will see emerge throughout the reportage, if you do get the time to sort of go through it and look at the notes people submitted or the surveys. Fighting at school was a primary concern. So this is linked to the sort of broader concern around violence and bullying and fighting. These were far and away the greatest safety concern that participants discussed in both formats. So that was true in the surveys, it was also true in the in-person discussions. A common view that came up in many of the discussions is that SROs are most effective at stopping active fighting among students, as opposed to teachers, for example. And some, opined that they felt that SROs would be less useful for other tasks than perhaps conventional police in the case of a worst-case situation, or other school staff in the case of a kind of everyday situation that didn't involve violence or fighting or weapons. However, and this is an important one, a few groups discussed their sense that social media and video recording, specifically the capacity to record fights or altercations, were presenting a real safety concern in the schools, and in some senses really exacerbating fighting, bullying, violence. There was a sense that the ability of these videos to be taken quickly and uploaded online and to go viral really intensified already challenging situations that made everyone feel unsafe. Some students linked this sort of environment around social media and violence and law enforcement in general and SROs in the schools specifically to a sense that being in school, quote, already feels like prison, and discussed and described how they felt that this sort of use of social media or use of filming of incidents on campus really exacerbated, again, fighting and bullying especially. There were also some concerns within this context, within this conversation, about the ability of SROs to address the root cause. And a little later, when we get into the other methodology, you'll see that there were other respondents who had some thoughts and ideas about ways to address root causes, ways for various staff members and SROs and faculty to work together to ensure the safest possible environment. So on the next page, we'll go ahead and dive into some additional themes that really link to this. Thank you, Slide Master. So this is an important one and a big one that came up and was particularly prominent in the in-person events, which I will remind you were more diverse and more student-heavy. So one of the themes that came up over and over again is the idea that there's really no one-size solution for creating school safety, right? That the idea of safety doesn't have sort of quick, simple, singular solution that protects everyone. Specifically in this context, people describe the need to take Indigenous and Black and other people of color's experiences and broader contexts, both seriously and into account when thinking about what school safety looks like. Some groups cited, quote, disproportionate arrests of Black students for the same offenses that they perceived to be committed by other primarily white students. There was also concern expressed, particularly on the part of parents, who talked about their experiences saying that they had had SROs who they felt were targeting their boys especially. Maybe they had multiple students in the school, but they only had these issues with their sons, that they were being frequently stopped for searches, not necessarily because the boys had done anything or indicated any kind of risk to anyone else, but just the notion of a kind of random but not so random search. So parents shared this, particularly in the concept, or in connection with Native students and Native boys, as well as Black and other boys of color, who they felt were often singled out for undue attention and suspicion. There was also concern raised about SROs who were known to the school, sort of the SRO community, being largely white and largely male. So this is a theme that also pops up in the survey where people said, hey, we'd love to see greater diversity. We'd love to see a female SRO. We'd love to see SROs who represent other kinds of communities like the queer community or the disabled communities that exist in Duluth. Seeing more diversity on staff, both with respect to SROs specifically, as well as the broader hiring practices in the district. Another issue that came up in thinking about this sort of background context and specific, particularly vulnerable groups is the issue of students with mental illnesses and students with various kinds of disabilities, who several parents in particular talked about being written up for disorderly conduct or not having the resources that they needed to really be supported in situations where they perceived that perhaps an SRO was not the best first responder, or perhaps there were other resources on campus, or could be other resources on campus to deal with, for example, a moment of dysregulation. And one of the things that I would add here is that teachers in particular were very concerned about having the support they needed, and many students joined in to say we want to make sure that our teachers have the support they need. If there is an incident, if there is a dysregulation that occurs among the student population, to make sure that there's more than one person who can address it and more than one kind of resource available based on the kind of situation that's occurring. One of the things that was really key and really highlighted in these in-person discussions, but also very much in the surveys as well, is the fact that students who reported positive SRO relationships, positive interactions with SROs, more than one interaction with particular SROs, expressed a greater sense of safety and comfort with them, and also expressed a higher level of confidence in their efficacy at their jobs. So this was really important. SROs were viewed as friendly and helpful and really effective when they listened to students, when they were seen to be taking their concerns seriously and treating them with respect. And also when they helped to address challenges that students themselves raised. So you do see kind of a contingent of participants saying, hey, I want to be able to go to the SRO or at my school and to talk to them if I need, get help when I need. What does that look like for me? Another really key point here that was linked to this issue of positive social connections with SROs is that students who had multiple avenues of positive contact with SROs, who knew them by name, who were neighbors, who had seen them around all of the time and regularly had conversations with them, not just on school campuses, but outside of school, in the community, students who played sports and had SROs as coaches, all of these kinds of multiplicity of social connections related to much higher reports of positive interactions, positive impressions of their roles, a sense that they were safe and great resources, and greater knowledge about what they were supposed to be doing in the schools, a greater sense of confidence in SROs generally. So this is really important, and again, something that will come up again. Some examples from the text. One person shared that the current SRO at their school was their football coach, and so they were able to go to them in a number of different contexts and environments. They knew them very well. They felt very positively about those connections, and as a result, about SROs at large. So those individual connections are really important, and relationships occur over and over in the comments, in the surveys. This is a really key thing. Another respondent in the in-person events said, quote, my SRO was my friend's dad, and that positive connection was really helpful. So a number of people were really aware that they felt good about SROs, they felt safe with SROs, specifically because they knew one or two in person, in particular, in a lot of different contexts. They've seen them outside of school. They knew them by name. It was a reciprocal relationship. And this was something that was really important, again, not just to students, but also to staff, also to family members, also to teachers, really broadly read. There were also a number of specific concerns about particular situations or particularly vulnerable either populations or students that were raised with respect to whether or not someone felt safe with an SRO. This was also something that came up in the surveys, so something to keep in mind about specific issues and specific populations that raise greater vulnerabilities and sensitivities toward contexts in which safety is able to be experienced. Additionally, queer students, members of the LGBTQ community, reported fewer positive interactions with SROs and described things like misgendering and just in general having really negative and really difficult interactions with SROs. This was also true of students of color who less frequently described positive or safe interactions. And who brought up more concerns about sort of the broader context and culture of the relations between law enforcement generally, not just in Duluth, but in the state and in the country, and the kind of cultural aspects of that as well. So something to keep in mind when thinking about this. Another population that raised specific concerns were students who had either been asked to speak with an SRO about an incident they witnessed but weren't involved in, or students who saw something that they felt needed to be reported and who went to an SRO to describe what they'd seen, to talk about an incident that they'd witnessed. Many of these students said that they were treated with suspicion or that they felt that assumptions were made about them or about other students who maybe weren't involved. And that they weren't really getting listened to, even though they felt they had really valuable information to share that might help the whole community be safer. One in particular talked about being asked not to tell anyone they'd spoken with an SRO. So these kinds of interactions really raised questions for students and impacted how they felt about SROs broadly. And how they felt about whether or not they'd go to an SRO again, or if they had thought that that was a resource they could use, and then they had a negative interaction, or found themselves feeling like they were treated with suspicion or not really being listened to. Those students found it much harder to have confidence in the future. I'll only read a kind of couple of the quotations you see here. All of these were taken from different discussion groups on different days at the in-person events. They kind of highlight some of these themes and the different ways that people talked about them specifically. Like I said, for time, I'll just read a few of them, but you can come back and look at this. You can download it later if you'd like to go through. I do encourage taking advantage of all the great resources that are out there and the feedback people gave. Some participants said, quote, if you only see the SROs as scary, why should SROs expect students to come to them when they feel endangered? Another pointed out, quote, there are racially discriminatory practices in policing, meaning in general. We need to be able to trust police in order to be just in their practice, and that's just not happening now. Another person said, quote, as part of the LGBTQ community, I don't feel safe with the police officer at my school. He continues to call me a girl when I do not identify as a girl. Somebody else said, quote, I value that our SRO is a member of the community, and a way to improve safety at other schools is making sure they have an SRO like ours. Really pointing to those kind of relational qualities and the specific nature of, sort of really positive connections being related to really positive experiences with great SROs. Another, commented and said, quote, my son struggles a lot with mental health and his experiences with SROs haven't always been great. And another raised the question of disorderly conduct being kind of subjective and, sort of what does that mean? What do we do in the gray areas? How do we address those situations? There's more to the story in multiple situations. So you see people are engaging with these ideas. They're going back and forth. They're sharing personal stories and also sharing their opinions about what safety looks like and for whom and in what contexts. So we can go to the last page on the small group discussion themes from the in-person events. There's a few that I really want to hit home here. They are kind of linked to themes that we've just discussed. One of those, again, is that during some students' interactions with SROs, they raised the sense that they didn't feel like they were being listened to, specifically about incidents they've seen in school. They were concerned that there were faulty assumptions that were brought to bear, and described, not feeling comfortable with SROs as a result. Related to this theme that we've just discussed, There were absolutely exceptions to this, and one of the things you note with exceptions is that there are particular people who come to the fore. So people were able to say, my SRO so-and-so by name. This was something that you'll see pops up a lot later as well. Students who were able to name their SROs in general knew them better and had more positive connections and more positive perspectives on what it was like to engage with them. Once one group had a participant who said, quote, all of the students love SRO's name. He's a real resource. You'll see again that those who had really positive things to say about SROs often knew specifically who they were talking about, really underscoring the relational context of these interactions and the extent to which not knowing your SRO or not having good connections or having had a bad experience really impacts how people think about school safety more broadly and whether and to what extent they can trust or go to or rely on these same roles in the future. So something to keep in mind. Another issue came up in some of the discussion groups where students said they believed or they were under the impression that SROs were supposed to come speak to their classes as a way of introducing themselves, their names, giving a little bit about their roles and what sorts of things students could expect to see from them or when students could come to them to get support. But the students who believed that was a current policy said that they had not yet had that kind of casual relationship building interaction. So there is some suggestion that students would be interested in knowing more, in having more information, in having more opportunities to connect with SROs, particularly those who don't come in with a connection, who aren't a family friend, who don't play sports, who don't have other avenues for already knowing their SROs, kind of even the playing field so that others who might not have those connections are able to start building those relationships. In general, you see that students were enthusiastic about having opportunities to provide their feedback in a serious forum. Many students talked about feeling gratitude for being brought into this engagement process, for having adults in their community ask about their opinions and their experiences on this, and expressed interest in ongoing discussion, with some participants pointing to previous student-led initiatives and engagement opportunities as a positive thing. So some mentioned the sort of research and report on SROs in schools that had been done by a few students previously. I believe it was the spring of 2021. And they were able to present that work. They made their own presentation and presented it to the board. And those who knew about this experience thought really positively about students being able to be involved in the conversation like that. Students and other participants of the in-person events expressed interest in seeing SROs explicitly trained to work with youth and kids. And in particular, they expressed concern about teachers having to respond to fights or ending up by default being the first responder when there's a fight or an incident of bullying or some kind of aggression that happens on campus. With many preferring to see an SRO intervene, or again, in the case of a dysregulation, lots of people thought, if it's a mental health illness issue that's happening, they'd rather see a counselor address it. If it's a fight or an instance of violence, they prefer to see an SRO intervene rather than seeing a teacher, pulled away from their regular responsibilities to try to handle that. A smaller contingent of students said they wanted to see or believed that SROs should be involved in providing assistance in suppressing drug use on campus, and that might be a specialty or an area of focus for which SROs were particularly well suited. Another contingent of students, in particular, but also community members, were interested in seeing more opportunities for small group support and mediation and other kinds of group solutions. So one of the things that came up specifically were restorative circles at Lincoln. One discussion group was talking about this. And one person said, why is there so much conflict in the schools? Somebody jumped in to describe and said, quote, it's not the teachers, it's the kids having problems with other kids. They fight off school or off campus and bring that drama here to the school. The crowd follows the winners. It makes it bigger than the fights would have been otherwise. Social media aggravates it by publicizing it. There's an attitude of, oh, you're tough, let's fight, or oh, this person beat you up, huh? And then they fight over that. I'm willing to fight too, even if I feel like I'm not getting help when I've asked for it. So this group got really into this conversation. Another person said, well, school feels like dog eat dog. One fight leads to another fight. It's a real problem. The response to that was, well, how can more SROs help? Can they get to the root of the problem? Will more SROs solve these kinds of problems? Another person jumped in response to this conversation and said, this faculty member, staff name person, they named them specifically and said, this person's room feels safe to me. Students hang out there after school. And they brought up the restorative circle at Lincoln, saying that it was based on the idea that there's a small, tight group under 20 people, and everyone is responsible for being respectful. Students confront the, quote, don't snitch people, or people who are escalating issues. If you bring more SROs, won't school feel like prison? Should we try another approach? So in this conversation, one of the things that they were talking about, they covered a lot of the themes we've just been discussing. But one of the big things they were talking about, right, is what kinds of resources exist already in the schools that are working and that provide different kinds of opportunities for mediation, for support, for conflict resolution in non-urgent situations that really help to get to the heart of the issue, and also equip students and faculty members and staff members and other folks on campus with more resources to turn to when they need it. Another issue that was raised, or another concept that we saw over and over in the in-person event discussions was just gratitude toward teachers, toward staff members, toward counselors or integration specialists, people who students and parents and staff and community members could call out by name and say, I had an amazing experience with this person, I feel safe with this person is my resource or my go-to on campus. We need more people like that, or we need more support so that we can make sure that we have enough staff able to provide those kinds of resources. Again, there was a lot of gratitude toward those who show up and all of the wonderful people who work really hard to make schools feel safe and students and teachers and staff feel protected. Just to underscore again, sort of related to these themes, participants of the in-person events really highlighted that the whole school community context is important, as is student background and experiences with police outside the school context, as well as experiences with their specific SROs outside the school context, and more broadly, again, taking into account the whole context of these interactions, which, as you can see, varies widely depending on the particular relational qualities and aspects that are coming to the fore for particular people, particular students, particular families, and teachers and staff. Some of these themes you see represented in the quotes on the page. One person said, quote, this is the first time we've been able to share our voices on this, and that's really great. I wish that the school would give us more opportunities to share what we believe. Another said, quote, I think the SROs should be there to facilitate safety, not make you feel nervous, gesturing to the kinds of interactions they wanted to have. And another said, quote, our counselors are also a great resource. Sophomore year, my parents got divorced, and I trusted that I could go to them for help. We have a good environment for getting help. Next slide. I am sorry, I think I accidentally went off screen there for a moment, but thank you, Slide Master. All right, so at this point, we're going to transition a little bit. We're going to move into discussing the survey results. There's a lot to get through here, so I'm going to try to cover it as quickly as I can. But again, if you have questions, we can absolutely get to those later. I'll start by giving a little bit of an overview about what we saw in the surveys, who answered them, what those responses looked like. So as you may recall, we had 225 respondents fill out the online surveys and give us their feedback. The schools that they were associated with were broad beyond just the host schools of the in-person events. And they included Denfeld High, East High, Ordine Middle, Lincoln Park Middle, Lowell Elementary, Compton Park Elementary, Laura MacArthur Elementary, Lester Park Elementary, Piedmont Elementary, Stowe, Homecroft, and Myers-Wilkins, all elementary schools. A school called Grant, which was closed in 2011. A school called Harbor City International, and the University of Minnesota at Duluth. So pretty broad spread, lots of different age groups and populations. Again, a few things to note, just under 10% of the respondents of the survey identified themselves as Black, Indigenous, Asian, Latinx, or other people of color. So you're looking at a largely white population in the responses, which is important if you think about the extent to which participants of both the survey and the in-person events talked about the importance of their kind of personal background and how the broader context of the relationships and interactions is important. Another thing to keep in mind, as I mentioned previously, so the in-person events were about 70% students. The surveys themselves were about 61% family members of students. So the largest population was family members of current students. But we also had 14.2% who were staff members. So that includes teachers, that includes staff and other administrators, folks who are working in the schools. So again, another largely adult population. We did have about 9% of the respondents who were students, and about 9% of the respondents who were community members. So one thing I'll ask you to keep in mind about this, we provided people with the opportunity to share a range of different connections they had to the schools, and many people did. So people were identifying kind of their primary role. A number of others decided to identify multiple roles. So you'll see there's lots of folks who were also reading tutors or who had been former students and now had their own students in the schools. There were people who were both staff members, so family, parents, and also who worked in the schools, who had kind of both of those roles and both of those concerns. You also see, again, former students who were substitute teachers, so it's a whole lot of different intersections that emerged in how people were related to each of these schools mentioned here. So we can flash through the next two slides, which just kind of highlight that information, the variety of roles, retired faculty, parents of former students, parents of upcoming students who were looking at putting their students in the schools in the next school year. So beyond that, the first question that we asked all of the participants of the survey, and you'll note that the questions we asked in the survey were aligned with the questions that we asked in the small group discussion guides. So it's not two different sets of information. Both populations were provided with the opportunity to answer the same questions, just in a different format to be accessible. So the first question we asked is, have you had any experiences or any interactions with school resource officers? Of the 225 people who completed the online surveys, 55.1% said yes, they had at least one experience or direct interaction with a school resource officer. 44.9% said they had not had an interaction directly with an SRO. On the next page, we asked them to go a little bit deeper into what those interactions might be to get a sense of how are you interacting with SROs. So we asked if you have had an experience or an interaction with an SRO, what was that like? 136 people responded to this question for a response rate of 60%, and about 76% of the responses here were positive. So they were positive experiences that this particular response group population felt really good about. About 4% of these responses were negative. 3% were mixed, so they included some things that went really well, some things that didn't go so well. 7% of the responses were neutral. So we'll get into what neutral means in just a minute. Largely that was people who maybe ran into an SRO on the school campus but didn't have anything much to say about the quality of that interaction one way or the other. 10% of the comments in response to this question were literally just no comment or not applicable. So we'll go a little deeper into each of these comment groups and look at what that means. So on the next page, we have a little bit more detail about the positive experiences. So for the 103 respondents who said, yes, I've had an interaction with an SRO, it went really well, here's why. 76% had that interaction. The key words that they used in the different stories they shared or comments they made were polite, professional, some form of like kind or friendly or welcoming, really speaking to those personal qualities of the interaction. They would talk about how it was relationship building. Often specific officers were mentioned by name, so this very much closely aligns with what happened in the in-person events, where people who had really positive experiences were able to name the person. They were talking about a specific person, a specific individual with whom they had particularly good interactions, who they knew fairly well. And again, we're very particular to the kind of relational aspects of that. So some examples of the positive stories people shared and the way they talked about their positive experiences are included on this slide. So you'll see that a family member of a student at Ordine East Middle School said, quote, "My personal interactions with SROs have always been very positive. They have been friendly and welcoming. They have been active and engaged in the life of the school, coaching, greeting students as they walk into school, participating in community events, and students in and out of the building. However, I see things through the lens of a white woman who grew up thinking and experiencing law enforcement to be positive and safe, people to turn to when in trouble, and with character to emulate. Our son is white and sees things pretty similarly." So again, that was a family member of a student at Ordine Middle School. And this is a great one. It kind of highlights a number of the themes we've already discussed. This person, knows their SRO really well, has always had positive interactions. They really highlight the lengths to which the SRO is personable and tries to get to know not just the staff or the students, but also the family, the community. They highlight how much that means to them, those interactions, and they also point to the relevance of their own, attitudes growing up toward law enforcement, their own prior interactions with such authority figures out in the community, really linking it to, this is the baggage I'm bringing to my response, and a real sense of self-awareness around the context of these interactions and what specifically it is about those interactions that they found so positive and so valuable. Similarly, a staff member at Ordine said, quote, "I've had nothing but positive interactions. The SRO is in the hall, talking to kids, helping them find their classrooms, open lockers. The SRO at my school seems very interested in building positive relationships with staff and with students." So again, the relational qualities turn out to be really central to what makes people feel safe with SROs and what they love about them the most. Often, as you see in the book I just read, that extends to things that are outside of perhaps the explicit role of an SRO, and that turns out to be really meaningful for folks really across the participant populations, across demographics, community members, family members, parents, students. All of these people really value some of the same things about their SROs when they have positive experiences. Similarly, a staff member at Denfeld High School said, quote, "Most of my experiences up until this year have been proactive. The SRO talking to students about what to expect about court and foster situations, laws, etc. They have also humanized police officers who often shared experiences about being a parent, child, teen, and sharing their sense of humor. They have been essential in dealing with reactive experiences, as I have had several students take an overdose of pills while at school. Their professionalism and quick actions save lives. They are the first people everyone looks toward when we've had threats or alarms going off. They're extremely well trained in de-escalation and keeping everyone calm." So you're seeing here a staff member identify ways that the SRO has been useful to them, ways that they've made use of their services and specialties, and also really highlighting still the sort of humanizing effects of those interpersonal relationships and contexts. On the next page, we go a little bit in depth into the negative experiences. So as I mentioned, there were only 6 of these. That's 4% of the overall number of folks who responded to this question. Keywords here were, quote, "uncomfortable," frustrating, unwanted, bias, punishment versus trauma-informed. So the themes you see here really very much coincide with a lot of what we saw come up in the in-person discussions, which, as I mentioned, were a little bit more ethnically diverse and had a different age group kind of makeup, which is relevant. Here you see a family member of a student at Lowell just saying uncomfortable. You see a former student of both Ordine and East say, quote, very frustrating. It involved a criminal sexual assault, which was ultimately not investigated. So again, a nod toward particularly vulnerable populations or particularly sensitive issues that were not handled well. You see, here, a family member of a student at Linden Park just said, quote, I didn't like my interaction. A family member of a student at Laura MacArthur just said, quote, they talk about needs, not children. A family member of a student who was also themselves a former student and community member associated with Lowell said, quote, there is a negative bias against Native and Latinx families, including the assumption that all siblings in the family were then destined to be failures after the interaction had with one student. The focus was on punishment, consequences versus helping families with underlying intergenerational trauma. So this person brings into it a broader context and concerns about a family that's connected to the schools in many different ways. Finally, you have a family member of a student at Ordine who just said unwanted. On the next page, we learn a little bit more about mixed experiences, so those that were a bit more ambivalent about SROs. There were 4 responses in this category for 3% of the total. They used constructions like, quote, polite but, not knowledgeable about next steps, or polite but, not aware of power dynamics, etc., and raised concerns specifically about minority experiences in the broader school context and environment for people of color. So one person said, quote, the SRO was polite but not knowledgeable. He seemed to feel his job stopped when he issued the citation and had no knowledge of what happened next. Another said, quote, mixed personally in my opinion as a former staff members. I have concerns regarding the climate for people of color. Another person said, quote, I met them through community organizing events and at Marnita's table event. The SRO seemed like a nice person, but maybe a little ignorant about power differentials that exist. And then the final person says, quote, I had an encounter briefly at the beginning of this year. He was very polite. In my own high school career, I had encounters too with another SRO who was a jerk, but I didn't grow up scared of cops. I just learned keeping my mouth shut and saying, yes, sir, got you a long way, even if you thought you were right. So again, kind of mixed bag responses. The final page we won't spend a ton of time on. This is folks who said they had a neutral experience. So there were 10 of these, or 7%, who said, their experience was okay, no details, who gave a neutral description of an encounter. So they said, well, I casually pass them in the halls, or I see them when I'm picking up my kid from school, or I reached out for help with my child, and no details, that sort of thing. We also had 13 responses, so about 10% that just said, no comment, NA, never had an experience, I don't know, is this new? These were mostly people who just wanted to fill out something for every category, every question in the survey, but didn't really have much of anything to add on this particular topic. The question on the next page says, if you know anything about SROs, what do you know? We gave people the opportunity to share. What do you know? What do you think about the roles of SROs? Do you know anything? Do you have questions? 183 people responded to this question with an 81% response rate. Key observations here, the reality is people had widely ranging perceptions of what they knew and didn't know. They had wide-ranging responses about knowing nothing at all to feeling like they were really well informed and had a lot to share. By and large, people understood the role of the SRO to be related to policing and also relational roles, central and community understanding. So lots of people really linked SROs to being role models or to having relationship building responsibilities with kids and staff and parents. So that relational piece turned out to be really important, even here when it comes to questions about what do you know about SROs and their roles or their training. Another issue here, a lot of people said that they believed that SROs were to be a resource for school safety, but what school safety looked like was very different. It was defined very differently by different respondents. So you had a whole mixed bag of things that could represent school safety in people's minds. There also was really strongly a desire for positive interactions among students and SROs across the survey responses. with some people saying they want SROs to be good role models or good models for healthy relationships with authority figures in general for their kids. So that was another key piece here. On the next page, I'll go into a few of these. I'm going to highlight the keywords and themes. I don't have time to read. We have a lot of slides to get through, and I don't have time to read all of the quotes. So feel free to return to these if you'd like. Some said that they believed that the role of SROs was to be, quote, more than a cop. Many talked about role modeling roles and providing positive policing experiences. A number said that their role is to prevent school shootings or violence or bullying on campus. Some used this question to raise concerns about specialized training for schools and to ask, are they trained to work with youth? Can they be trained? Do we know anything about that? Others said that they knew about racially differential treatment. Others said that they knew of or had heard of aggressive responses to students related to tasers and arrests. And some raised the question of efficacy here and said, what do we know? I don't really know much. Like, how can I get more information? A number of people specifically wanted Duluth-specific information, so not just SROs in the country or the state, but very specific and district-relevant information. I'll read just a couple of these. So some of the examples of the ways people talked about this, they said, quote, SROs are police officers chosen by the Duluth Police Department. They do not have special training to be in educational settings and vary in the way they interact with students of various cultural backgrounds. So that was something that a community member associated with East High School said was what they knew about SROs. Another respondent said, what I know about SROs is, quote, their historic role is for safety and crime prevention in schools. That's a community member who had been associated with Condon, Ordine, East Denfeld, and Harbor City. A staff member from Piedmont said what they knew about SROs was that they were to build relationships with kids, but doing that before issues arise was key. That SROs did not want to intervene unless absolutely necessary, but do so appropriately and swiftly when needed. Another said, quote, what they knew was that they are Duluth Police Department officers contracted to be on site at the 4 secondary schools. They said that they believe the district pays most of their salaries to the city and that they are not intended to be issuing citations or arresting students, though the data on those interactions has not been made readily available. I believe from DPD's social media posts that they are all white officers this year and some are new to the role. That was a family member of a student at Lowell. So again, I'm not saying personally those things are true, that's just what people said when they were asked what they knew about SROs. So the next page will just provide some more examples of other ways that people talked about what they knew or what they believed about SROs. So you can return to that for more on that. There's another page, there's several different ways people talked about this. They talked about fostering relationships, building relationships with students and offering a feeling of protection at school. They talked about knowing them on a personal level. The sort of last page on knowledge about SROs, this third slide here says, quote, I know 2 of the officers through youth sports, so I know them on a personal level. Very kind, compassionate individuals. Also, officer says their name, was at East High School and helped prevent a shooting 3 years ago. I know that having SROs in the building can help curb that sort of violence. They also establish quality relationships within the community by getting to know the students and family personally. That was a family member of a student at Lincoln Park. So you're seeing different kinds of knowledge or different kinds of experiences with what people think they know about SROs. On the next page, we asked, are SROs important to have in schools to get a sense of people's opinions, and why or why not? 212 people completed this question for a response rate of 94%. 77% said yes, they believe SROs are important. 16% no, and raised particular concerns. And about 7% said they weren't sure, they didn't know, or they were on the fence. It kind of depends on what their role is, and they didn't know, or no comment. With respect to the yes responses and the rationales, people really raised concerns about fighting and gun violence in schools, the feeling of living in particularly dangerous times, a sense of needing protection from outside threats, and often those perceived to be posed mainly by other children. So this was another issue where people A group of respondents in the survey kind of singled out children who were perceived by them to be deviant or pathological in some way, and said that they had punitive expectations for those who were identified as, quote, problem kids or families. There was an emphasis on teacher overwhelm and staff safety, as well as a reiteration of interest in positive student SRO socialization, among parents especially, and a strong interest in deterring and avoiding violence, as well as a desire among many respondents to show the best and most relational sides of law enforcement, so really highlighting those relationship building opportunities. One said, one of these examples says, quote, yes, Duluth has an increase in kids coming from gang and crime-ridden areas of the country with no fathers in the picture of their lives. They have no respect for people or property. We need an SRO in place to help control some of these disrespectful students, end quote. That was a family member of a student at East. So you're seeing the identification of students perceived to be a problem, perceived to be outsiders, with a kind of stigma attached to their whole family, right? Just saying, bad families from other places, they're bad kids who need to be handled. So again, this kind of gets to some of the underlying assumptions that we saw in a lot of these yes responses. The kind of rationales were often, it's the problem children, not my children, who need to be, quote, controlled. There was another one who said, quote, yes, in this day and age when mental illness and drug usage is so rampant, it's important to have law enforcement involved in everyday issues at school. My daughter has witnessed the SRO chasing kids down the halls and teachers needing to call for his help. Neither she nor I would feel safe at school if there wasn't an SRO there, with 7 or more children to go through East and future grandchildren as well, and the ways of the world. It surely isn't going to get better. It's more important than ever for law enforcement presence at a high school level. So this is a family member at East talking about their sense in general that sort of the world is becoming more violent or more dangerous, and so SROs are needed for that reason. And then the next page actually just lists additional yes responses, very similarly sort of along with the thread of themes that have already been mentioned. So this first example says yes, because of the dangers of school shooting, we need to have trained staff to deal with possible threats to students and staff. Other quotes from here highlight kind of related issues around violence, gun incidences that have had previously. So again, really highlighting some of those previously raised concerns. There's a third page, a lot of different ways people were talking about these themes highlighted here. One staff member at Denfeld said, quote, absolutely, SROs are important. No SRO, no me as a teacher. We obviously need police help at our school this year and every year. For some students and staff, SROs may be a trigger, but for the majority of people, they are welcomed. Do we have to concentrate on people in the minority with their attitudes about SROs? This was another issue that came up as well. As I mentioned again, this was something that was really evident in the in-person conversations, is that there were a number of minority groups of folks who are particularly vulnerable, who are dealing with kids who have mental illnesses or other kinds of disabilities, kids who are neurodivergent and have different experiences, folks who have experienced sexual assault, or other kinds of traumas, students of color, Native boys and Black boys. So all of these groups that, are numerically a smaller proportion of the community, but who are reporting negative experiences at a much higher rate. So there is a suggestion of, a value to understanding what it is that minority and majority perspectives bring to the table and why it's valuable to listen to both. So on the next page, we have the no responses, and I know I'm coming at time, so I'm going to try to just highlight the key words for the next few slides and questions, and if you have a follow-up or you want to get deeper into this, the information is available through sticky stats in the room that you'll be having your meal in, I believe. And again, you can also look this up, contact us later with follow-up questions. For those who responded no, that they did not feel that SROs were important to have in schools, The issues that were raised were about the school-to-prison pipeline or the process of beginning sort of punitive behaviors for certain populations really early and in school and kind of funneling them into long-term records that ultimately become criminal records. There's also the desire for more clarity about roles, like what specific roles SROs are supposed to be undertaking. There was a lot of interest in and questions about the possibilities for conflict management alternatives and social service or mental health resources, concerns about students of color being targeted or singled out for harsher treatment, with some students and families of color in particular saying that they felt less safe. Proactive approaches were preferred by many in this group who said that they sensed that safety could be provided in other ways, and who were interested in having police close by, like off campus, Duluth police, available to respond to emergency situations rather than in the schools full time. And here as well, you see some folks talking about the kind of rapid response time of off-campus Duluth police. We can scroll down to the next page, which I will point out, addressing the same theme, just provides additional sort of quotations on that theme, where people talk about how the Duluth police and the community respond really quickly when needed, and they'd rather see off-campus police for worst-case scenarios. Where they talk about the possibility of both de-escalation services, community liaison positions, and feelings of safety that some people get from having officers in the school being able to be provided by non-police services with proper training focused on community development and transformative justice and de-escalation. Talking about wanting to see more qualified social workers and people from the BIPOC community, so greater representation and other kinds of resources. The final page just addresses the not sure, don't know, on the fence, no comment questions here, with again about 7% of respondents to this question saying that more data was needed, or it kind of depends on the role, or highlighting that the conversation and context is really important. The next page highlights the question about whether participants were familiar with alternatives to school resource officers. 52.3% said they were not familiar with any alternatives to SROs. 32% said yes and gave particular ideas. 15.8% said maybe. The next page just asks more specifically what kinds of alternatives for school safety would you be interested in if you had a choice. 163 people responded to this with 72% question response rate. 55% said none, or they'd like to see more SROs. 38% had specific recommendations, and 7% said they didn't know and weren't sure. The key words and themes here for folks who had an alternative in mind was social services and more support for mental and behavioral health, more Black, Indigenous, and other people of color staff, administrators, and counselors, restorative justice approaches, metal detectors, door security, and hall monitors, as well as zero tolerance policies on violence, trained conflict resolution professionals who were unarmed, as well as training for current staff in conflict resolution and de-escalation, community-based mentoring and volunteer support, and culturally competent relational approaches and whole family support options with clarity and intention around the meaning of school safety. The next page also highlights some additional ways that people were talking about this, so you can return to the exact quotations if you want to see the specific resources people pointed to. One of the ones here on this page talks about increasing social workers and integration specialists, community volunteers or paid support to be greeters and hall monitors, additional staff who were more representative of the student community, student leadership opportunities and mentors, partnerships with community groups like Men as Peacemakers, the NAACP, United Way, Fond du Lac Tribal and Community College Law Enforcement, CITS classes to be inclusive of underrepresented students, and training opportunities. So a number of ideas. People had a lot to bring to the table on this. The next question was, is there anything that makes you feel unsafe in your school or community? 183 participants responded for an 81% response rate, with 93% saying, yes, there are things that make me feel unsafe in school, and 7% saying, no, nothing really makes me feel unsafe or have a particular feeling either way. The things that made participants feel unsafe, they listed bullying and fighting in schools, especially at Denfeld, the availability of guns and frequency of gun violence in the broader community, as well as armed presence in the halls, so police, SROs, or otherwise students, anyone really with a gun. Lack of support for overwhelmed teachers and staff made people feel unsafe, especially since the pandemic, and bearing in mind staffing shortages. People split on whether or not an SRO did or didn't make them feel safe. School lockdowns due to violence, low door security, and poor hall monitoring in high schools especially was raised as a thing that made some people feel unsafe. Smoking and vaping on campuses came up as a safety issue, as did the possibility of harsh or punitive responses, specifically to neurodiverse students, if and when dysregulation becomes a challenge, as well as the lack of trauma-informed responses, or the perceived lack of trauma-informed responses. COVID and pandemic-related issues came up as a safety issue, so folks not wearing masks properly, as well as the lack of cultural awareness and a need for inclusive signage in Spanish, racially motivated violence and fighting were all mentioned as things that made people feel unsafe. There were some things people mentioned here about what made them feel safer. So they would say, I feel safer when there's community connection and supportive school relationships that are established and healthy, when they're able to feel welcome, included, and belonging in the school community, when there was clear and consistent communication, when there's awareness among some that the context of the relationship and qualities of interactions impact whether SROs feel safe or not to particular individuals and communities. So some people were pretty self-aware about that and felt like, I'm aware that my background means I feel safe or I don't feel safe with SROs. The next page, we asked more specifically, is there anything that could make you feel safer in your school community? And 164 people responded to this question for a response rate of 73%. We asked, follow-up question, if you needed support because you felt unsafe. Hello. No worries. Take your time, Elijah. I can actually, for the interest of time, I'm going to keep talking, but you can go ahead and get the slide together. So we asked, if you needed support because you felt unsafe, what kinds of resources would you like to have available, and is there someone you want to talk to? 138 people also responded to this for a question response rate of 61%. The page following highlights key takeaways, so things people said made them feel safer. Included more mental health resources and services integrated into the curriculum directly, specifically for students who wouldn't be able to access those resources otherwise. So some people said because of financial barriers or because they didn't have parents who would be able to take them or they didn't know about resources or had transportation. For students who aren't able to access mental health resources and services, having that directly integrated would be really helpful and supportive in helping them feel safe. They mentioned more support staff on campuses generally, so staff don't get overwhelmed, and talked about having mental health and crisis support teams who would have the support of the administration and staff, as well as the broader community. Folks said they felt safer or would feel safer with de-escalation training for staff, an investment in community and relationship building within the school community, preventative work on smoking and drug use, as well as emotional, psychological, and behavioral health supports. Folks said they would feel safer with more supervision and monitoring support for certain spaces, specifically bathrooms, parking lots, hallways, and cafeterias, including options to have unarmed community volunteers or parents providing that relational support context that was so central in these responses, and ensuring secure entry in general. People also talked about the fact that they would feel safer with, quote, common sense gun laws and gun reform. So again, the issue of school shootings and violence on campus and also in the broader community was by far one of the major concerns that people had. People talked about SROs without tasers and guns being something that would make them feel safer. They talked about engaged education about their role, purpose, and efficacy, as well as relationship building opportunities for SROs and families and students, a zero tolerance policy for violence and bullying, and more options for homeschooling and alternative schooling environments for those who would want or benefit from them. I only have a few more slides, so I'm going to quickly get through it. I know everyone needs a break and a meal. Some of the other key takeaways for feeling safer were folks said that more teachers and time built in for teachers to develop relationships with students, including smaller class sizes and after-school activities for all, not just athletes, would help them feel safer. Virtual meetings to get to know families, students, staff, and administrators. More accessible school and district leadership, and more staff of color and spaces and tools for connection at school would make them feel safer. You'll see there's some quotations here that describe different ways people talked about that. They also said that cultural and trauma responsive supports in the curriculum, in the physical environment, and in other ways would really help them feel safer, including things like staff having implicit bias training and understanding to see people of color as both worthy, that we matter, that our ways of being and knowing that trust is valid. So people talked about feeling safer with diverse curriculum, which takes seriously the experiences of Indigenous, Black, and other people of color, including things like reading groups on race and culture for family and community members. So key insights and opportunities, as you have now seen, a lot of people emphasize the relational qualities and the broader context in which interactions with SROs are happening and in which they would be able to feel safe. So some of the opportunities that emerged from the things people said were the idea of making explicit the role, responsibilities, and function of SROs to students, families, and community members, so everyone can be brought up to the same page in terms of what they actually know about SROs. Ways to incorporate, families and students into explicit plans for active shooter emergency scenarios, which many people were concerned about. And other approaches to, addressing concerns about gun violence in schools was a theme that people were really interested in having. Providing Duluth-specific data on the efficacy of SROs, creating more opportunities for relationship and trust building among students and families, including safer spaces for minority opinions and unheard voices to emerge, engaging proactive planning for de-escalation or the prevention of fighting and bullying in schools, considering incorporating more restorative circle models like that at Lincoln, making sure students and families are familiar with the social, emotional, mental, and behavioral health support services that already exist in the school, and providing more of those opportunities for connection and engagement and after-school programming for all students. Additionally, providing more opportunities for student-engaged research. This is on the next page, the final page, and reflection, or participatory decision-making in age-appropriate ways people talked about, as in the student-led presentation to the board. Some people talked about the possibility of considering plainclothes SROs and remembering that students who know their SRO by name and have more positive social connections, such as a friend of the family, football coach, neighbor, etc., more commonly report positive experiences with SROs, as well as the oft-mentioned desire to see more diversity of representation among SROs specifically and school staff more broadly that would be inclusive of queer people, people of color, and women, as well as the modeling of behavior and providing practice opportunities for students who want to talk to an SRO or another school resource but are nervous and unsure about how to start a support conversation with existing counselors, interest specialists, and other staff resources. So that's the bulk of the information. I know there's a lot there and there's even more that we could go into. So again, we're going to give you, as you transition, I know we'll give you a little bit of time to process and get through. But I will be here later for any questions for our Q&A session. So thank you all. I apologize for the amount of information we had to get through in such a little time, but your community provided very rich responses and a lot of content. So thank you to all of you.